Hello, my brothers. So today I am going to be going through the optimal training checklist, meaning these are the things you should be ticking off to make sure that you're getting the most effective training to help you in your health and fitness journey. Okay. And that doesn't mean there is a one size fits all. There is different dependents and factors which come into play when you're selecting and going through your most optimal training program. Okay, so we're going to go through those. Contents of the page is being exercise selection and why certain exercises are selected, how to make substitutions, how to progress, how to regress. Form and execution, how to make sure, first and foremost, that these are absolutely spot on, why they are considered the most important element of any exercise, and how you can maximize your form and execution with the help of a coach. Tempo, so I'm going to explain exactly what the tempo is and essentially how to implement this into your training as well. The same with intensity, why it's super important, what it actually is, how do we measure it, and how do we make sure, again, we're implementing this into our own training. And then finally, rest and recovery. So why this is super important to see the best results possible, how to rest and recover properly, and what are the factors needed to be considered for optimal rest and recovery overall. All right, let's jump into it. So, exercise selection depends on a multitude of different factors. Okay, so we want to consider the target muscles first and foremost. Are we specifically targeting one isolated muscle? Are we targeting a group of muscles? What's the goal? Are we trying to get stronger? Are we trying to get bigger? Because this is the classic debate between what's better, free weights and your machine or plate loaded weights, the supported equipment. Now, there's loads of different ways to look at this. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. If you were to simply put it as black and white, then I would go with free weights being the better option because they give you a more functional movement pattern and they probably work on more areas, or they do work on more areas in just performing the skill itself, because you've got to think about core stability, you've got to think about the stabilizing muscles. However, let's look at it this way. If you're really targeting the chest, okay, and you've got to select between the chest press, the isolated chest press, and a bench press, and I'm most concerned about building muscle in my chest, I'm going to choose the chest press purely because I am now supported in a seat. I don't have to think about my core stability. I don't think I have to think about my forearms, my wrists, my grip position. All I'm doing is literally putting 95 to 99% focus into that push. It's got its own movement pattern, so you don't have to think about the direction and then just control it on the way back. Whereas a bench press, I've got to think about my foot position, I've got to think my core stability, having the bar above my head, where's it going to come down on my chest, etc., etc. So not only physiologically are you using less muscles with a machine press rather than a bench press, but also mentally you're having to think about a lot less when it comes to that machine press, meaning you can put full force and full energy into the exercise itself. So that's where fitness and physique goals do really come into play. Of course, if you are an athlete, then I would always advocate for free weight movements, functional strength, rather than trying to build isolated muscle, unless your sport is, of course, bodybuilding. Next, you've got to think about your individual capability, or for any coaches out there working with anyone, their individual capabilities. And this comes, this has to be included with injuries, mobility, skill. So I wouldn't bring someone into the gym and start teaching them a barbell thruster on their first session. No. What I might do is I'm going to, analyze their movement pattern first. But of course, the bottom of a squat or that particular movement would be an air squat. No weight whatsoever. Even maybe if they have such poor mobility, it could be a box squat. Then you want to start thinking about how to make this a little bit more difficult for that individual. Or you again want to understand what they are actually capable of. If this is a pretty seasoned trainer or athlete and they're able to get full range of movement, range of motion in their squat, and they're able to pretty much go ass to grass, then great. We can really start to then implement progressive overload or look at their strength in the depth. We can start to really analyze the movement as a whole rather than just working on the basic mechanics. Regression and progress, or progression. So this is great because movements, more often than not, and this is where CrossFit really does come into or shine a light on these sort of things, because you can always regress or progress a movement. If you're from the CrossFit world, this is when you have an RX movement. So for example, a bar muscle up, what not everyone can do, and you scale that to a more applicable or a more accessible movement. So you could swap a bar muscle up for a box bar muscle up, a banded bar muscle up. Instead of a toes to bar, you could do a V up. And if you look at it in a more traditional weight training sense, you can swap a free weight barbell squat for perhaps a goblet squat where you're holding the weight in front of you, or of course an air squat. Or you might want to isolate the muscles or isolate a particular part of the movement, and you could use a supported squat, although not necessarily the best option when you are trying to teach movement patterns. And finally, equipment availability. Whoever you're working with or whoever you are, you have to consider what you have, around you, what you're able to actually work with. If you tell me that you don't have a sled, or if you tell me that you don't have, particular machines, then you're not going to see them in your plans. You've got to work with the tools that you've been provided with. And that doesn't mean the less tools, the less progression. You can very much make, a tremendous progress by using bodyweight movements or a simple library or arsenal of equipment such as dumbbells and barbells. I know this myself. I think we all went through it through COVID, where gyms were shut and we had to improvise. Okay, I didn't gain loads of muscle, but I definitely maintained what I had for a good 9 months, just using mainly bodyweight movements, but also adding weight from less traditional and more unorthodox items around the house. Okay, next we're into form and execution. Now, this is huge. This is the thing that you should consider to be the most important in your training and the most effective for your progress. So I would always say form definitely comes first. Practice that form, implement that movement pattern. Execution then, now you've got the form in place, now you can really execute that to its maximum potential. And that comes with intensity, which I'll touch on in a minute. But, a lightweight, get the form right, and then you want to get the execution of the whole movement right. Then we have to think about progression as a last thing to, consider when it comes to training. Progression doesn't always come in the form of weight. You can progress by lowering or slowing the tempo. You can increase the difficulty of the exercise. So going from a supported machine to a free weight movement will be an example of that. You can also reduce your rest time as well between sets. So there's loads of different ways you can progress without actually increasing the load on the barbell as well. Video checks. So these are super, super important. Not only can you get to yourself and film yourself and watch back to see any flaws in your technique, but you can also ask your coach to do this if they're not already doing this already. This is one of my favorite parts of what I do on my program. I love watching you guys grind it out in the gym, looking to get better, being uncomfortable, filming yourself and sending it in. Like, I can't ask you to do any more than that, and then it's up to me to help you then progress. I love it. And even myself, I've been training for now 14, probably coming up to 15 years now, and there's always flaws in my technique. There's always flaws in everyone's technique, especially as you are trying to increase the weight or get heavier, or even learning new skills. Like, you might have just started a new training modality where there's a lot of new skills to learn. That leads me on to my next point. Think of this as skill-based training. You wouldn't just walk onto a tennis court and start, doing overhead serves. You wouldn't just walk up to an Olympic lifting platform and try and snatch 100 kilograms. You wouldn't just walk onto or into a CrossFit competition and attempt to start doing handstand walks. These are all skills as they may be simple, and then, especially in the machine's point of view, they are simple, but it still requires you to create that movement pattern in your head, get used to the actual weight, get used to the movement itself, and get better at it. And think of it as a way to get better at it, which will increase then your progress in the gym and overall functional movement, functional strength, as well as, what other goals you may have, such as physique and hypertrophy goals too. And finally, pretty simple. If you're hitting movements with the best form, that means you're going to get the best gains. There's no substitute for really, really good form and execution. And if you're one of those guys in the gym that are currently relying or ego lifting and lifting too heavy and relying on a swinging motion, on using other body parts, half reps, then just stop. Stop it now. Take the weights down, temper back, and relearn, reprogram yourself to be a better athlete. Tempo. So I've mentioned this a couple of times already in the presentation. Tempo is a really cool tool that we can manipulate to not only make things more difficult, but make things more appropriate or suitable to actually what we're trying to achieve. So the easiest way to kind of create or differentiate between two goals where you'd manipulate tempo would be powerlifting and bodybuilding. Bodybuilding, you're trying to sculpt the body. Bodybuilding, you really want to make that mind-muscle connection, and you want to connect you want to really feel the movement. Keeping it as slow and controlled as possible is going to probably reap the best results for most movements. However, if you are a powerlifter / Olympic lifter, then you don't care about feeling the movement. You actually want the movement to be as efficient as possible, as light as possible, and that requires using multiple parts of the body. It requires a lot of power in the lifting phase and almost no concern around the eccentric phase. Okay, of course there is some concern where you want to build that strength there, but for the actual movement itself, the eccentric is a little bit redundant. So a tempo, in really simple terms, is the speed of the movement, and the numbers 3010 is an example of a common intensity used. That would actually be, tempo used. That would actually be a ratio rather than seconds. So the negative, the eccentric part of the lift is the first number, so the number 3. Then there's a 0 because there's no pause. The number 1 is the concentric phase, the push in a bench press scenario, and again 0 because there's no pause. So you can either use seconds and count to 3 in that eccentric phase, coming down 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, 1. Yeah, and that will help you, hit the movement with the right tempo and get the most out of your training that way. So as I said, there's different tempos for different results. Typically, the slower, the more controlled the tempo, the better, the more muscular hypertrophy you're going to experience. Whereas if it's a little bit faster, heavier weights, focusing on the concentric phase, then you're going to build a lot of power and strength too. And for those of you who haven't really worked with tempo or considered it, if you just implement this small factor into your training, it is a game changer. And also, as I mentioned, it's a form of progression where you can manipulate it to make the movements a little bit more challenging. Intensity. So like tempo, this is another factor of training you need to consider. And the intensity is pretty much how difficult the movement is, how much effort you're putting into each and every rep. So this is usually measured in two forms. The RPE, which is the rate of perceived exertion. This is typically more suited for more experienced trainers who have a much better idea of their capabilities and much more experience in lifting, so they can use that as a comparison. Whereas reps in reserve is a good overall tool for really anyone to use. And, reps in reserve essentially means how many reps are you saving in the bank. So, by the end of the last rep, you should maybe feel 1, 2, 3, depending on what your coach has said, that you have, those in the bank that you could actually continue to do. The reason that you don't go to failure is dependent on why the coach has implemented that. But essentially, you can use this to ensure that you are maximizing your sets. You don't want to be doing, again, using the bench press, 1, 2, 3, 10. Well, get on your phone and you've hardly broke a sweat. You want to be doing 1, 2, all the way up to 10 being a real big struggle, but you're able to do it without that form breaking. And then when you put the bar back, you should be, pretty out of breath, a little bit red, a little bit sweaty. That shows you are actually, performing with the right intensity. And that can be a huge difference between someone who's not getting that intensity up to a certain degree versus someone who is, and the results are going to be huge in terms of differences when it comes to, overall performance, but specifically and especially with hypertrophy and strength gains. So usually, pretty much a greater intensity equals better results. At the end of the day, the harder you work in the gym, the more you're going to get out of it. And then finally, this is something that really gets neglected by pretty much everyone. But if I told you this is actually probably the biggest catalyst, the biggest indicator for what your results or how good the results you are going to experience following a good training program, then I think you might change your mindset around rest and recovery pretty quickly. So the three things really to consider most importantly, and then I've got a little addition there, but sleep is huge. If you're not getting good, consistent, quality sleep, then say goodbye to those gains, because that's where the recovery and restoration process really, really does happen. The same with nutrition. If you're feeding your body with shit, with fast food, with takeaways, not enough protein, all sorts of jazz, then again, you're not really giving, it's like asking a building firm to build you your dream house. You basically give them all, all the skills. They're the best men in the country to do this, but you ain't giving them the tools. You haven't given them the resources to actually build the house. So instead, they're putting together scraps of wood. They're using outdated machinery. You're just not going to get the best results or the optimal results that you can get. And then active rest days. So I call these active rest days because I don't feel rest days should be lying horizontal and just eating and sleeping for the rest of the day. I think to avoid DOMS, so delayed onset muscle soreness, tightness, stiffness, and to really promote that blood flow around the body to make sure that, again, we're transporting nutrients effectively and recovering properly. Active rest days are super, super important. So by this, instead of training, what you could do is go on, leisurely walks, recreational sports, yoga, stretch, Pilates, things that aren't really going to take you out of a zone 2 sort of place within the heart rate. You don't want to be too intense because that would then take away from the rest. But you want to be active enough where, again, you're able to kind of keep the blood flowing, keep moving, keep yourself, nice and active throughout these days. And then finally, stretching and mobility is super important. So, you want to be able to implement this at least twice a week. It doesn't have to be at any point. Mobility could be done as a warm-up because it's, classed as dynamic stretching. Stretching in the static sense should be done after a workout or away from a workout. And like I say, this is going to help, offset any niggles, any pains, any tightness, but it's also going to allow for more muscle fibers to actually grow within the muscle itself, because you're actually stretching it apart, allowing the sort of dead muscle cells to leave, because that's what obviously you're doing through the training, and allowing new muscle cells to grow within inside. And therefore, getting stronger, getting bigger muscles is the end of the game and is the goal, that we're aiming for. All right, guys, so that's pretty much it on the training optimal checklist. If you have any questions, then of course, please do comment, and hope you enjoyed the video. Peace out.